Hi, welcome to the webinar recording of the second Electrification Stakeholder meeting hosted by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, focused on electrification in Minnesota. We're delighted to have you watching this video. I'm recording this first intro take, and then because I forgot to hit start on the record right away, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Samuelson. I work at Michaels Energy, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Michaels Energy is an energy efficiency consulting firm. We implement and evaluate energy efficiency programs in Minnesota and other states. And Michaels Energy is the Department of Commerce's contractor to organize and host these events. You'll see I shared results from a survey that I had participants take at the beginning of the event. We had almost 200 registered attendees and about 120 people attending the live webinar. And so all attendees were in listen-only mode. But we wanted to encourage participation in this stakeholder event, and that invitation continues to you watching the webinar afterwards. We hope you'll engage in this content and attend future events. My contact information is at the end of the webinar. Please reach out to me if you've got any comments or want to get involved more. We did ask attendees to ask questions via the chat features. And at the end, we had a qualitative input session in a poll for them to participate in as well. So thank you for your interest in the event, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. This is the agenda for the event. In a moment, I'll hand off to Anthony Fryer from the Minnesota Department of Commerce to introduce some guests and offer some background on this project. After that, at about 10:20, we have an impressive slate of guest presenters, and I'll come back on to introduce them at that point. I'm going to publish the results of the poll. And you can see where, a split of utility, government, nonprofit, and business organizations today. The majority of guests do live in Minnesota. Many people did not attend the January 7th kickoff event for this project. So welcome if this is your first event. We hope to give you good background on the project itself in a minute. And a variety of expertise about electrification on the call today as well. Okay, I'll turn this over to Anthony here for his remarks.
Thanks, Carl, and good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying the last few weeks of summer here, and many thanks for joining us this morning, whether you're in Minnesota or another part of the country. My name is Anthony Fryer. I'm the Conservation Improvement Program Supervisor for the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And given the number of people that are either out of state or did not attend the first meeting, as Carl mentioned, we did want to just go into a bit of background on the project, hopefully to provide context for the great slate of speakers that we have coming up this morning. The Conservation Improvement Program, just by way of background, is Minnesota's energy efficiency resource standard, and the implementation of that. We have about 120 electric and natural gas utilities in the state that are required to meet a 1.5% energy savings goal. And the Department of Commerce sort of plays two roles with that. We regulate the program itself to ensure that the utilities are meeting the statutory requirements as they're laid out. But we also work with the utilities to provide technical assistance to help them achieve those goals as well. And that comes through by way of our technical reference manual and the development of that. We have an applied research and development grant program that funds a number of studies to increase our knowledge around efficiency programming and technologies. And then we also have an energy savings platform that allows utilities to report data into a centralized database. It is, I think, important at this point to also mention that there is a fuel switching prohibition within our conservation improvement program, and I know that varies across the country as to whether or not they are included. But in the Conservation Improvement Program in Minnesota, we do have fuel switching prohibition, which essentially means that electric utilities direct electric end uses to existing customers, and natural gas utilities must do the same also. So this project is sort of wider or broader than the Conservation Improvement Program, but it is run through the Minnesota Department of Commerce and has been funded by the U.S. Department of Energy as part of its State Energy Program competitive grant process. And the team that we have here working in Minnesota is led by the Minnesota Department of Commerce and myself as project manager. Our subcontractor on this is Michael's Energy, led by Carl Samuelson. And then we also have the Environmental Initiative, led by Malia Hausnet, providing consultative services to this project as well. So we really feel like we do have a strong team here. In terms of the goals of this project, they are to examine the benefits and concerns of electrification as a tool for grid optimization, energy efficiency, and emissions reduction in Minnesota, and to convene a series of stakeholder meetings to provide information, facilitate discussion, and solicit recommendations on key electrification topics. We do have, I think, a sort of proud history in Minnesota of sort of deep, weedy dives into complex topics with our stakeholders, and hopefully coming out with very important and instructive outcomes. The purpose of the stakeholder meetings through this project will be to provide an educational forum to learn from one another, like I'm sure we'll do today, and also to share information with one another. It's also to provide an overview of activities happening around the country. Minnesota is obviously one of 50 states, and there are various states in various sort of levels of progression with electrification efforts, and some of those are certainly ones that we can, I think, learn a considerable amount from in terms of their experience to date. The end result of this process will be a report that provides considerations for Minnesota stakeholders that are interested in pursuing electrification activities, that identifies and examines concerns and barriers around increased electrification, and then highlights areas for additional research. Next slide, please. So before I talk more about this project and discuss the upcoming events, I'd like to invite Charles Satterfield from the U.S. Department of Energy to make some opening remarks on behalf of DOE. Charles is the DOE lead for this project, somebody that Carl and I have worked with for the last year or so, and have deeply enjoyed our work with him and the resources that he's been able to provide at a national level. So, Charles, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, Anthony. Thank you very much for that. My name is Charles Satterfield, and I work for the U.S. Department of Energy as a project officer for the State Energy Program. DOE is and was excited to partner with Minnesota to support them in their strategic electrification efforts and potentially creating a roadmap for future adoption should this project, of course, successfully prove its viability. Thus far, Minnesota, and specifically Anthony Fryer and Carl Samuelson, have done an excellent job in managing this award to date, especially in light of the global pandemic that we are all struggling with. Minnesota, despite that, continues to seek ways to engage stakeholders and create a space for meaningful discussion surrounding beneficial electrification. And we hope that this project will prove its viability in Minnesota and will have the desired impact that Minnesota and DOE ultimately hopes for. Today, I, with the rest of you, will be in listen mode only, and really looking for me to hear from the experts in this space and to ensure that this project that's being funded under DOE is successful and has the necessary impact, and making sure that we remain on track. I want to thank you all. We are very excited to continue with this collaboration. Thank you for letting me speak, but I certainly want to turn it over to the experts, and I will be gauging, while I'm listening, gauging opportunities for further technical assistance should this project need that as well. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the good work and effort that you've put in this project thus far.
Thanks, Charles. Much appreciated, and many thanks for joining us. If I could go to the next slide, please. So this time I'd also like to invite Dr. Aditya Ranade, who's the Deputy Commissioner here at the Department of Commerce for the Division of Energy Resources, to also make some opening remarks on behalf of the department.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me start by thanking you all for coming today. Before we get into the main portion of this morning's agenda, I want to take a moment to introduce myself and talk a little bit about the importance of this project. As many of you know, I was appointed as Deputy Commissioner for Energy Resources at Department of Commerce earlier this year. Before I took on that role, I spent the last 14 years, broadly speaking, in renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors, most recently leading the global smart grid research and development program at 3M, serving utilities across the world, including Southern California Edison, Electropaulo, and Enel in Italy, to name a few. What really attracted me to this position was to engage in public service, not only be a student of energy policy, but to actually shape it and to serve Minnesotans. So I'm excited to be in this role. It's clear from the number of people who have registered for this meeting that electrification is a subject of great interest to Minnesotans. My hope for today's meeting and this project in general is that it provides a forum for interested stakeholders to share views on what they see as opportunities or concerns with greater electrification in the state, to develop a deeper understanding of the issues concerning electrification from one another, including the presenters. And it's also my hope that based on these conversations and research that take place, the department and Minnesota stakeholders will be able to develop an understanding of the possible impacts of electrification and which areas require greater research so that we can address issues or concerns. I would like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy for funding this project, the department staff, Michael's Energy and Environmental Initiative for leading us through the process. I would also like to thank all of you for your participation and commitment to this very important subject. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from today's presenters. And at this time, I would like to hand you over to Anthony Fryer for more details on the project and today's meeting.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Before I hand it back to Carl to take us through the main portion of today's meeting, I wanted to provide you all with a project recap and also an outline of the major next steps happening this year. Many of you would have attended the first stakeholder meeting on January 7th at Hamline University. Obviously, for many reasons, that feels like a long time ago now, having a sort of large in-person meeting like that. The purpose of that meeting was to introduce the project. We had a presentation from the Electric Power Research Institute. Tom Wilson provided a great overview of sort of electrification at the national level. And then Carl Samuelson from Michael's Energy provided us with an overview of an electrification white paper that was completed in 2018. The second stakeholder meeting had been scheduled for March 5th, but was postponed for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the emergence of COVID-19 was happening right around that time. But we also had, at this time, the Minnesota legislature in session, and there were bills that were being introduced during that time that would have allowed for fuel switching in SIP as part of a larger sort of SIP reform efforts that would have, under certain circumstances, allowed for the inclusion of electrification in utility program efforts. And because of this, and because of the sort of direct relationship between what was being proposed and what we're discussing here, we felt that it was necessary to temporarily put a hold on this project to allow the legislative process to play out. None of these bills were passed into law, meaning that fuel switching within the Conservation Improvement Program continues to be prohibited at this time. The third thing I wanted to mention here is the fuel switching stakeholder process that many of you would have been a part of last year. That was the purpose of this process that Burr Energy were leading us through, was to re-examine the need for the existing fuel switching prohibition in the Conservation Improvement Program. Fuel switching has been prohibited since 2005. And that isn't included in statute, but rather that is an order that was issued by the department at that time in consultation with stakeholders. Two stakeholder meetings were held last year to discuss whether or not the fuel switching prohibition should remain in place, and if not, what it should be replaced by or how it should be replaced. So this process was also put on hold during the legislative session this year, similar to this project. But at this time, the department does not anticipate recommencing this effort. Rather, if fuel switching was to be included in the Conservation Improvement Program, we feel that that should be part of a larger, comprehensive legislative reform rather than an administrative change. The current SIP framework was enacted in 2008 and did not explicitly consider or account for fuel switching or electrification efforts. And to address all of the complexities of fuel switching and electrification, and to provide greater certainty and direction for the SIP regulated utilities, we certainly feel that legislative change would provide the most effective vehicle for this at this time. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of immediate next steps for this project, obviously today's meeting is the first step in recommencing this project. And we're certainly looking forward to hearing from several Minnesota-based speakers who will share their perspectives on electrification. We also have a meeting coming up on September 9th, which will be our third stakeholder meeting, where we'll hear more about electrification efforts happening across the US, and that will include presentations from the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships out of New England, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the Rocky Mountain Institute as well. And we hope that many of you can join us for that meeting also. In the fall of this year, we will be hosting a series of technical advisory committee meetings to develop a deep understanding on a number of issues concerning electrification, with the intent of reporting findings and recommendations back to this largest stakeholder group. This technical advisory committee was sort of outlined and mentioned at the January 7th meeting, where we had a call for members of this group or for folks to volunteer for this group if they had an interest in the time to dedicate toward it. The Technical Advisory Committee will be limited to Minnesota stakeholders, and we'd like to keep the group to around 25 organizations. And in addition to those that have already volunteered their time, the department will also be reaching out to additional organizations to ensure that appropriate stakeholder representation is achieved. in this process. As always, do feel free to contact myself or Carl Samuelson with questions about this project, and certainly the Technical Advisory Committee is something that we'll be providing more information on between now and the September 9th meeting. But at this time, again, many thanks for your participation in the call today, and I'll hand it back to Carl to take us through the main portion of today's meeting.
Thanks, Anthony. Just one comment I'd make. If anyone missed the January meeting, slides from all the presentations are available on the project website. We'll have a link again at the end of the presentation, and I think maybe the WebEx will spit you out to that page after the meeting as well, if I did my technical setup right. And you can navigate to the resources page to find that content. So next, I'm excited to start the panel of presenters. We've invited a wide variety of presenters representing different Minnesotan perspectives. Each speaker has been asked to highlight key issues and concerns around electrification that matter from their perspective or from the perspective of the group of people they represent or work with. We'll chat out a link right now to their bios. I've decided to share that in a PDF document instead of introducing everyone at length. But please check that out so you can learn more about these excellent presenters. And I'll just briefly name the person and the organization before each person begins. And so I'm delighted to start with Winona LaDuke. She's the Executive Director of Honor the Earth. Go ahead, Winona. Okay, I need to unmute you just a sec, Winona. Here you go.
Oh,
okay,
thank
try
you.
Again.
That's better. Ani, Nindoy, Maganaduk, my relatives, how are you? And special greetings over there to Ben over at Leech Lake. Nice to see you, Ben. Share some similar concerns. So I live up on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. I am a member of rural electric co-ops, and as well my organization purchases power from Ottertail Power, and we also have Minnesota Power in different locations. And so my concerns are really about the equity of infrastructure in Minnesota and how we build it, how we build infrastructure for the future in Minnesota that makes some sense. And I had, a couple of observations to start with. Now, when the REAs started in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, whatever, most of those farmers already were on electrification. They had their own Jacobs 10 kilowatt wind turbines, or they had this or that. Our tribes didn't have quite so much, but promised by the rural electric co-ops that it would make it easier for them in their lives. And so now, we find ourselves in this situation where it seems that a lot of these rural co-ops don't have a lot of regulation or pushback. And so a lot of decisions are made in the North, particularly I think that affect Indian tribes and rural consumers, that make me question infrastructure equity. Who gets to decide what infrastructure and why? And that is a very significant problem in the time of climate change. And that's also a significant problem in terms of how we're going to be secure in our communities in the future. So can you go to the next slide, please? I don't know if I can do that. Thank you. Okay, so this is a slide from Lawrence Livermore Lab on how much energy we waste. So I want to start with that, because to me it's pretty significant that we waste about 60% of our energy between point of production and point of consumption. And that has to do with a lot of D in energy infrastructure. That's part of what we're all talking about here. We're moving stuff really far, and a lot of our stuff is really inefficient. And then we make a lot of inefficient choices in terms of where our energy goes. I'm not going to go too far into that, but I think that trying to figure out how to build more electrical capacity in Minnesota and elsewhere should really start with trying to get far more efficient than we are now, and really thinking about where our energy comes from and where it goes. And I want to say, for most of you who probably don't know, a lot of this energy came with huge impact to Native people, whether it is the dam projects which flooded out all our wild rice, or the big hydro dam projects in northern Manitoba that destroy our communities, or maybe it's coal generation, or all of these things have had a significant environmental justice impact on Indigenous peoples, which is really not addressed and needs to be addressed. So I care about how much power is produced and where it comes from, because we've already been flooded, we've already been dammed, or, or we have a big coal generator or perhaps a pipeline. The other thing I want to point out is the choices that Minnesota makes. So I was very grateful to the Department of Commerce for filing this appeal to the Certificate of Need for the Enbridge Line 3. And the reason I think that that's important is that the single largest energy consumer in the state of Minnesota is Enbridge. Single largest energy consumer in the state of Minnesota is Enbridge. Turns out that moving sludge takes a lot of power. And so the point is that we make decisions, and decisions are being made on how to power sludge moving in northern Minnesota. And consequently, you have a situation where infrastructure like substations is being put up for pipelines that don't exist. And I want to know how that happens. How is it that rural electric consumers are coming up with infrastructure that, for instance, there are new substations along a proposed power line and proposed pipeline that there are no loads near. And so who gets to make those decisions? Just pointing out Enbridge 20%. The other thing I want to point out is that mining is the most inefficient use of energy pretty much. So, these decisions of what demand is and load is are really decisions of equity and should be really reviewed a little bit more thoroughly before we start building infrastructure for massive inefficient systems. Next picture, please. Hello. And this is my next concern, which is power outages. So I live on the White Earth Reservation, and we face energy insecurity already. We are people that spend about a quarter of our money on heating. The U.S. spends about a fifth of our economy on energy. So we're pretty addicted and subject to the vagaries of a lot of systems. But our tribe spends about a quarter of our money on energy, including heating. Now, these power outages that are increasing dramatically during climate change are going to have a very significant impact on a lot of our rural co-ops and a lot of our tribal consumers. And so my question is how do we ensure energy and power security for rural customers and rural people in northern Minnesota, tribal or not? And the answer to that is really a more distributed energy system and not big stuff coming in from someplace else, because those power outages are coming. And so I'd like to see the energy infrastructure of Minnesota really reflect rural distributed power and support rural electric developments for tribes, for instance. So let me go to the next slide. This is a little bit of our challenge. So the challenges are who gets to decide what the infrastructure is and how you get online. So this is a project that we put up in the Pine Point community. This is 20 kilowatts of solar, which powers partially the Pine Point Elementary School, served by Itasca Mantrap Co-op, one of the rural co-ops. We had to fight tooth and nail to get that up. Now, a question is that so we paid for that ourselves, and we put that up ourselves. And so then the question is why am I being punished with high connection rates, with huge insurance policies, and with this net metering limit, which puts my tribe and all of our tribes in the north into this additionally precarious situation over the times ahead, where where net metering is really in fact punitive to our tribes. Another example of that is that our tribe, I think similar to Leech Lake, was funded by the LCCMR to put up 200 kilowatts of solar and some solar farms on our reservation. We're still working on putting those up, but the fact is that we got to come in under 40 kilowatts, which doesn't really serve the needs of our rural communities, which are going to be facing power outages. So I would like a rural policy or a state energy policy which supports equity in infrastructure and ensures that rural communities, tribal communities, are able to have access to the grid as needed, and they have the capital infrastructure support to, in fact, address the energy security needs that will increase in terms of climate change. Next picture, please. This is a solar thermal panel. And historically, the Department of Commerce offered money for low-income families. I think the amount was about $150,000 a year, was allocated so that our communities or poor people could have solar thermal. Now, solar thermal is kind of the low-hanging fruit of energy conservation. But the fact is that in Minnesota, we're cold as heck, but we're still sunny in the wintertime. And so solar thermal is like an ideal application of energy, an energy choice for the north. Now, this is a panel we put up in the Pine Point Housing Project about 4 years ago. We purchased the production systems for this, the technology from Rural Renewable Energy Alliance. And so these solar thermal panels are now being produced on the White Earth Reservation by tribal members. Now, what would be really great is if we could actually put them on low-income houses across the north, like they used to under an appropriation for the Department of Commerce. And my point in this is that, look, if you can save 20% of a heating bill in any house in the North Country, that'd be a really great thing, because right now we suffer from what's known as fuel poverty, the choice between heating or eating. And all of our tribes are super concerned about the implications of this in this winter and in any winter that comes ahead. So what I'm saying is that on one hand, you have, allocations that come from state agencies, and on the other hand is you have very prohibitive and very challenging systems for being able to actually implement the improvements that the state wants to support. And so what I really like is the opportunity to have equity in northern infrastructure and capacity for our tribes and others. We don't need to produce solar thermal panels just for tribal people. They should be across the North, but ensuring that we have ways to have some kind of security in the time ahead. And so that's really my interest as a stakeholder in our community. Next slide, please. That's us, 8th Fire Solar. And so I just want to say we're all in this together, and I'm honored that I was asked to participate in this. My concerns are the concerns of a lot of rural customers, and what we want is to have some kind of energy security and not be all stressed out when winter comes because we have a few options on how to heat our houses. And I'd really appreciate at this time that the DOC has given us, but also the opportunities that the DOC has to help transform the energy systems of Minnesota and look at these hard issues and how we make decisions for efficiency and good decisions on who gets to decide infrastructure, who pays for it, certainly, and what infrastructure we really need in the North. So thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Winona. Appreciate it. Okay, next is Ben Benoit. He's the Environmental Director at the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. I can unmute you, Ben.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Excellent, yep.
All right, so I have an ambitious presentation. Let's see if I can get through it. So I'll talk fast and hopefully move fast. So what is the Leech Lake Band? Well, we're a sovereign tribal government working for its people. We're in northern Minnesota. Next slide. So here's kind of a map of where we are. So we're located between Bemidji and Grand Rapids, north central Minnesota. We about 800,064 acres with more than half water wetland. About 750 miles of rivers and streams. There's a lot of fishable lakes, a lot of wild rice up here. And we serve about 9,000 people in 11 communities. This is an old slide, now it's about 17, and they're all kind of listed on the map here. So next slide. So we're a government, and we're broken into 3 districts. So I live up on the northeast side of the reservation in District 1, up in Inger there. But we have 2 other districts too. Next slide. So we have a tribal council that we have a chair, a secretary treasurer who serve the entire reservation. Then we have our 3 elected district representatives, 1 for each district within the reservation. Next slide. So here's our tribal council: Farron Jackson, Arthur LaRose, Robbie House, Steve White, and Leroy Staple Fairbanks. Next slide. So what do we have that makes us care about energy? So next slide. Well, we have people. Like I said, we serve about 9,500 enrolled members. The BIA workforce states about 9,000 are Indians eligible for BIA services on the reservation. So that's maybe not just workers, but their kids too. And generally speaking, it's kind of a poor rural economy. So the medium household incomes between $5,000, $20,000. And like Winona said, a lot of people struggle with their electric bills. I'm also a member of these rural electric co-ops, which we'll get into in the next one. So next slide, please. We also have resources. So there's a reason that our ancestors picked the Leech Lake Indian Reservation for our homeland. And it's because it's a timber-rich area. That's got a lot of history too. On the map there, you can see we overlap with the Chippewa National Forest quite a bit, where now the what was all Indian land is now a lot of federal trust lands held by the Chippewa National Forest. We have a variety of wildlife that really kind of make up our culture, who we are as people. We have a lot of fishing resources, and then there's a few pictures of folks ricing. We have a lot of wild rice up here throughout Leech Lake Indian Reservation. So as we think about things like climate change that could threaten these resources and the ability for our kids and our kids' kids to kind of live the same lives that we have and our ancestors did, that's really important to the people here, and preserving that is really important. Next slide, please. So what else does Leech Lake have? Well, we have an energy corridor. So here's a picture of the Enbridge pipeline that runs through kind of the heart of Leech Lake along the Highway 2 corridor. But also on here is a 230 kilowatt high line that runs power. We also have a railway that runs through the heart of the reservation, and we have natural gas pipelines that run through here. So really, Leech Lake has a lot of natural resources, but there's a lot of more modern resources that run through the reservation also. So next slide. We also have electric bills. So that's, I think, why we're here today talking about all this stuff. Next slide. So here's kind of our baseline energy. So we have 82 tribal facilities, and they're kind of spread out. And I like this map because it kind of shows the layout of all the electric co-ops, and then kind of the private industry that runs through the reservation too. So through the 82 tribal facilities, there's 5 different electric utilities on the reservation. We pay about $1.75 million annually in electric costs. And, you know, like anybody, we're looking to reduce those bills. On the earlier slide, I talked about how much, you know, kind of poverty, how the median income on the reservation is low. And you can see on the graph on the right that there's kind of a range of what people are paying per kilowatt hour on the reservation. So depending on which cooperative you're part of, lucky me, I'm North Itasca Electric Cooperative, which is the highest. My hookup fee is more than the other ones too. So I pay a pretty high energy bill every year. This is just electric, but there's also kind of a range of how you heat your house, like Winona was talking about. So there's folks who use wood, since we have a lot of wood here. There's folks who use propane, which is predominantly everybody. If you're not living right on that Highway 2 corridor, you're not getting the natural gas. And really, kind of the poor reservation communities don't have the natural gas infrastructure already in their house to reduce that cost, because propane costs about 40% more annually than natural gas does. Let's go to the next slide. So then that's who we are, and kind of what we want to protect. So that's how we've laid out our priorities. So we work for our people. We want to provide energy assistance. We want to make energy available for them. We're working for a future where the same resources that are available to us, that were available to our ancestors, are going to be available for our children. So what does that mean with climate change, with the risk of pipeline spilling? Well, those things threaten, you know, our future. And we want to work in ways that reflect who we are as Anishinaabe. So I was taught that if you take care of the lands and the Minoman, that they'll care for us. So that's what I want to do. That's kind of the message that really cascades, hopefully, all the work that I do for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. So next slide, please. So these kind of is the brief history of Leech Lake's projects. So in the early 2010s, the Leech Lake Green Team was established, and really it was focused on how do we reduce our waste? How do we go more green? And really that's kind of butted into our energy department, if you will, which kind of rests within our environmental program. So we've done some wind feasibility work. We've looked at different solar furnace stuff, as Winona alluded to, and really we've taken charge on some of those things, providing full solar furnaces throughout some of the low-income communities. Really, when we built our houses, we've situated them so that, you know, even though we didn't have the money now, or we didn't have the solar furnaces now, in the future we could put those things on there, and that pre-planning has really paid off, and we've been able to get some of our houses with these solar furnaces. But really trying to integrate that planning on the front end so that as we're developing different housing units, as we're looking to situate government buildings, that we're thinking ahead. We're putting in the engineering to make sure that when the money does become available, we can take those steps. So we're a tribal green step nation with the Minnesota, where we've done 5 200 kilowatt projects of solar PV across the reservation, which I'll talk a little bit about. In 2018, we did the Guaranteed Energy Savings Program, where we installed more solar, but we did a lot of retrofitting of our government buildings for energy efficiency. So I believe I have a slide on that in here too. And then in 2019, we actually did the retrofitting. We've done some EV work throughout the casinos, trying to expand that grid so that maybe not this year our tribal members will be buying EV, but 10 years from now there'll be enough of a network so that we can bring that technology here, kind of decrease our reliance on this petroleum and fossil fuels that people readily burn all the time. And then today, I think we're kind of taking a look at the future and what that holds. Learning from our past projects and seeing what that means for the future. So next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about the projects we've done. So these are kind of the solar furnaces that have been built. On some of these are private homes and some of these are housing homes. So the Leech Lake Reservation, or Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, has a housing program where we provide housing to low-income members who may not have the means to provide that for themselves. So we've worked with our housing department to make sure that our homes are situated with available solar, assuming that they're in a good situation, so that the house is built to have these solar furnaces, which can really help offset some of the heating costs that you see in these communities. Next slide, please. And actually, we partnered with Honor the Earth for a lot of that work there. We even brought some training to get some tribal members installing the stuff, and it was a really great project. The solar PV, so we did a 200 kilowatt arrays in partnership with our Real, and kind of coming back to this project and kind of the rural electric co-op discussion from earlier. Really, the ability for the band to work with our partners has been essential for these projects. So initially, when we had designed this project, it was designed as a 1 megawatt array, and instead we had to break it into 5 200 kilowatt arrays so that we could do more consumer-based placement of the arrays rather than a large kind of producing array. And the reason we had to do that is because the payback on it. So the way this program is designed is that the electricity generated from these arrays offsets the building's energy use. So our buildings would then pay whatever that offset is into our energy assistance program, and then that money is paid to assist people's energy bills in the fall. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating program where the revenues generated from the solar project is feeding right back into our energy assistance program. So that was how this whole project was designed. But when we got to the implementation part, we were unable to work with the local rural electric co-ops to do a big 1 megawatt array because they didn't want to pay a fair market price for that energy. So we had to break it into small consumer-based projects so that we could get the full worth of that solar on the back end. And I think that as we look towards electrification and as we look towards the next step, kind of working towards these goals, which we all share, in terms of climate change, in terms of getting people energy that they need, those are some of the questions that I think the Leech Lake Band would certainly focus on. So we've placed these solar PVs at the Prescott community, at our tribal college, the Jackson Village community, the Palace Casino, which now is repurposed, and then our Real facility down in Pine River. So like I said, they serve the low-income energy assistance program here with the state. It was a funded project through the LCCMR, and really it was kind of leading the way in what kind of solar gardens could look like. Next slide, please. So here's kind of how that financing worked. You get your solar arrays, those revenues go to your energy assistance provider. Then through that program, they've already identified folks who need additional energy assistance. Those funds are then given back out to the people. Next slide. So the Guaranteed Energy Savings Program, so that's a Minnesota Department of Commerce program. The savings that you get from your initial investment, the reductions in your energy actually feeds back into the loan. So if you had a $100 electric bill, now you're saving $20 off that. So your electric bill is only $80. You just take that $20 to pay back your initial investment. So really your bills don't change until the loan's paid back. Then you'd see the savings come back to you. So it actually went pretty smooth. We had a third party come in, kind of assess all of our buildings. We had decided to upgrade 22 buildings. It was a $3.8 million project. We're saving about $250,000 per year, and our payback's about 12 and a half years. The cool thing is we're saving 3.6 million pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, SOx and NOx, kind of as listed here too. So there's a lot of monetary savings, but also it's through work like this that you can see kind of the band as a whole reducing its carbon footprint. So next slide, please. And then I think this might be where we end, but lastly, we've had some EV chargers going up. So we've installed one at Northern Lights Casino, which is kind of on the south side of the reservation. I should have included a map here. And then we have two on kind of both sides of the Highway 2 corridor within the reservation. So there's one at the new casino, which is Cedar Lakes, located in Cass Lake, right off Highway 2. And there's also additional EV chargers at the White Oak Casino in Deer River, which is kind of on the other side of the reservation. So now the people of Leech Lake are kind of spread throughout the whole reservation. So there's not super centralized points where you can put these aside from our casinos to start with. But then now we're going to kind of look into our government buildings and really try to map out areas so that there's charging ports for people in the communities. Already we've seen some community members getting charging vehicles. So on the screen here, you can see one of our elders who has an EV car coming to charge for the first time. So it was pretty cool. And Brandy Toft, our Deputy Environmental Director, and myself met him out there to.
Ben, we lost audio for you there for a sec.
Oh, sorry. I said this picture is just of us with the elder there.
Yep. Just after that,
yeah.
You're fine.
Okay, so where do we find ourselves today? So our past energy projects have largely been successful. They've focused on making our buildings efficient and citing our renewable energy as a customer. Minnesota laws that facilitate that type of work. So we've been able to work within those confines to really make successful projects. But what's the next phase of energy planning and development for Leech Lake? Well, that's kind of what we're looking at now. So right now we've kind of got an energy strategic plan that we hope to tie into some of the Minnesota electrification, stuff that's being discussed today. It's a good time for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe to evaluate this landscape, to set aggressive renewable goals and try to accomplish them, and really push that focus out so we can help set goals for other people too. It's a goal of ours to be a leader in the energy, not necessarily just a consumer as we move forward. So I think certainly we're going to be looking at our own untapped renewable resources, looking at all these different service providers. How do you work within such a large landscape with a variety of different players in the game? I think we're seeing historically low interest rates and likely some upcoming infrastructure funding, which might be a good time to do some planning here, see what projects fit, what won't work, and really get ready for the next round of funding and future and what that could hold. So I think with that was my presentation. Hopefully I helped you out a little bit, or at least you learned a little bit about what we're doing up here on Leech Lake. So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. Next up is Jenny Edwards. She's the Director of Planning Engagement at the Center for Energy and Environment. And I've unmuted you, Jenny. Oops. Yeah, there you go. Great,
and I muted myself again. Thanks. Thank you so much, Ben and Winona, for kicking us off and really talking about the great work that's going on at the tribal and community level. Carl, just technically, am I coming through okay? Because it's a little slow for me. I may just shut off my video if you are not hearing me okay.
Your audio sounds good. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry for the delay on the slides.
No problem. Let me know if you have struggles. So I am the Director of Planning and Engagement at CEE. We're really happy to be a part of this great panel. Thank you to Anthony for your project management, Carl for what you're doing, and for the DOE to fund this effort. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for the state to take a step back, big picture, and think about this transition in a way that is transformative, equitable, reduces carbon and environmental impact as much as we can. So I'm going to share some thoughts that pivot a little bit towards some of the technologies that we've been thinking about at our organization, and just how the state uses various technologies and what some opportunities are there. Next slide has a bit of our organizational overview of what we do in the electrification space. A lot of it has started with our research groups, and we just are out in the field testing how different electrification technologies work, especially in the cold world that we live here. We know we need to make sure these things run on cold winter days. We've done a lot of work this year to launch the Minnesota Air Source Heat Pump Collaborative, which is a group working on sort of market transformation efforts funded by a number of state utilities. And as part of that, really focusing on the idea of training contractors and installers on what they need to know to usher in sort of the new technology transition. My team has done a lot of work on carbon impacts and load shifting. We've recently worked on a project funded by the Department of Commerce in collaboration with our colleagues at Slipstream in Madison, Wisconsin, to look at how could additional electrification maybe support a low carbon grid. And then we've been very active on state policy efforts here in Minnesota to strategically decarbonize the economy. So on the next slide, I will just focus in just to kind of give us some context. I'm just going to talk about space heating because I get a little overwhelmed when I think about electrifying everything. And so this is sort of an area that, as you can see, is pretty needed in our cold north. This is some data from the state's demand side management potential study in 2019 that just shows gas sales in the state. And if we want to talk about just space heating and hot water, that's about 72% of our sales. So big sector dedicated to space heating. And then the next slide is zeroing in a little bit more just on the residential sector. And this is a snapshot of how we heat our homes now. Where do we live, metro versus non-metro? A bulk of our housing stock is going to be in single family homes, although we have growing multifamily housing stock, and the bulk of our homes are heated with natural gas. So it's a fuel we need to think about at the same time. And I love that Ben mentioned solar thermal because I love that technology. It's a pet technology of mine, and I don't think we should lose sight of just the broader opportunities if we're thinking about decarbonizing the heating sector. But we also have a fair amount of our building stock that has electric heating, sort of traditional resistance heating, is served by liquid propane. So when you get down to it, and we think about a roadmap for the state, all of these individual cases are things that probably need their own strategies and attention. And so this is just a slide to sort of talk about how diverse we are as a state when it comes to space heating. Next slide, I'm just going to call out a few areas that our organization has been thinking about that we think are just incredibly important to plan for as we think about electrification. So the first is just the idea of advancing building shell retrofits. If we need to make our homes tighter. We need to really think, and this means sort of beyond even traditional efficiency that we think of today, but really to this level of deep retrofits. It is the number one thing that is going to save consumers money. And if we are electrifying our building stock, it is going to have huge advantage to sort of prevent price shocks, prevent peaking during both summer and winter. So I think it's a big piece of the puzzle that we need to really think about how to solve as a state. Second is thinking about energy resilience, especially if we're moving towards single fuels. We're going to have an increase in weather events. Winona had a slide that shows we should have been thinking about this 20 years ago, and many people were, but it's not going to get better. And I think that the idea of the planning for the extreme events, especially if we're heavily reliant on electricity, is something we need to think about and plan for. Third is just this idea of looking at the equipment supply chain and the workforce that supports this. It's going to be a great opportunity for the state to really invest in that workforce. Fourth is just calling out the importance of looking at our state's diverse communities and the job pipelines that can serve really a more representative group within our state. And this isn't about just workers and employees, but this is really thinking about, where we are building wealth with this transition and what communities we're building wealth in. And then finally, we've talked a lot, I think, especially at the policy level, about the idea of the gas system. It's a huge asset that's been invested in, but we do have this concern that as we electrify more of the system, who's able to sort of opt out of that gas infrastructure, and then what happens with the remaining costs. So I wish I was coming to you with answers to these questions, but I think my hope is that folks think about them, that we consider that they might be really important areas of future work for the state. And I'm just going to spend a couple more minutes going a little more deeply into a few of these. So the next slide just highlights, which I'll talk about in a little more depth. And then Carl, you can go ahead to the deep energy, to the next slide. So in terms of deep energy retrofits, I just want to call out that this is a cost argument primarily. This is our estimation, just real back of the envelope numbers, but on the comparative costs of different technologies. And you can see the technology a lot of folks have to heat and cool their house is a gas furnace combined with sort of a traditional central AC. Something like a heat pump currently is more expensive than that option. But if we look ahead to deep energy retrofits, I think that's where we can get some important cost parity. So costs are important, they're ever changing. Natural gas is incredibly cheap right now. But if we think about weatherization, that is an important piece of the puzzle here. The next slide is just about this resilience issue and shows some results of recent work we've done on how much are these systems really going to add to peak load. This is the situation in the summer, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that for efficient heat pump technologies, we actually might be reducing peak load below what we currently have in traditional air conditioning. So this is sort of an example of a hot day, and you can see we have the opportunity to actually bring load down if we switch from something like a CR13 to a heat pump, and even more so with deep energy retrofits. The next slide just shows something similar, but it's for a winter day. And this is an area we have a lot of headroom in the winter in some parts of the state, but we will be building load if we're switching from gas to something like a heat pump. That middle line, that dark blue line shows, we'll be adding on moderate days, maybe a couple of kilowatts per home. But this slide also has a positive side of that, which is as much as we can tackle existing sort of expensive electric resistance heat, we're really reducing those peaks. So forefronting those applications is important. And then as much, again, as we can think about retrofitting our home, we'll reduce those peaks even more. This is a moderate day. I think planning for the really, really cold days requires a little bit of different thinking just because of what our heat pump systems are doing. They're often reliant on a backup system on those days. So it's a little bit of a different story. And then the next slide, I think my second to last, just summarizes this. Again, back of the envelope calculation of winter peaks. But if we were to convert in our single family housing stock, if we were to convert all of our fossil fuels to heat pumps, we'd be adding about 2.7 gigawatts of peak demand on a moderate day. But we could decrease that by about half a gigawatt if we focus on just electric resistance applications. And we could decrease that by over a gigawatt if we actually thoroughly retrofitted every single family home in the state. So this is big picture what we're coming up with as where our state is for these opportunities. And all of these mean dollars, right? Dollars saved, outages that we're resilient against, et cetera. My last final slide is just to touch on the workforce issue because I mentioned it. I just wanted to share numbers. Again, this is from the State Department of Commerce potential study, but this HVAC sector is really high. It's estimated to be a little under 50% of our current energy efficiency jobs in the state, and it's an area that's poised to grow. Experiencing a large number of the silver tsunami effect of sort of retirements happening in this sector. So we need to be working on this now and thinking about who's building wealth with this new opportunity and how to get folks into these opportunities. So I think that is it from me, and just thanks again for organizing this and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Jenny. Next up is Andrew Moratzka. He's a partner at Stoel Rives. And let's see, do I need to unmute you?
No, I think, can you hear me, Carl?
I can. Yep, you're great.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. As I suspect many of you know, Stoel Rives does a variety of work in the energy space, representing customers, project developers, and utilities in various jurisdictions. I was asked today to provide perspectives from an industrial customer. And so just note that the perspective I provide isn't of one particular customer or group of customers, but instead intended to be a high-level perspective based upon our experience working with these customers. At the outset, I'll note that these industrial customers are very sophisticated energy consumers. They often have corporate teams that monitor and participate in various markets and regulatory forums as their operations are around the country and around the globe. Their monthly energy spend is quite significant, with some spending into the 7 figures per month here in Minnesota. Next slide. You can go one more, Carl, thanks. All right, so with this in mind and trying to account for what the agenda is, I'd like to briefly touch on the values of these customers. Briefly, their cost and competitive rates, rate setting transparency, and reliability. So what does that mean? To run their respective operations and maintain their competitiveness in the global markets, they need competitive energy rates and a reliable supply of energy. And to meet these objectives, these customers need rate setting to be transparent to allow for the effective stakeholder participation. Next slide. Now, as it pertains to increased electrification, I'd posit that there are at least 3 goals. First, there needs to be a clearly articulated purpose of the increased electrification. If the goal is decarbonization, then decarbonization should only be pursued when the benefits exceed the costs. if there are more cost-effective means of decarbonization and meeting the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals, then those goals should be prioritized over electrification. In other words, electrification shouldn't be a goal in and of itself. Second, when electrification is pursued, want to be sure to preserve the long-standing regulatory compact between public utilities and customers, or alternatively reevaluated depending on how electrification investments are undertaken. So historically, there have been two facets of this compact. The first is that public utilities accept an obligation to serve all customers requesting service in return for a monopoly franchise in a given area. The second is that public utilities are allowed an opportunity to recover and earn a reasonable rate of return on the prudent capital investments that are reasonable and necessary to serve their captive customers. The third goal is that, and while electrification is pursued and as part of the regulatory compact, we must not lose focus of on reliable service at reasonable rates, consistent with state law. To underscore, we can't have two-dimensional policy that focuses only on utility needs and environmental goals. Instead, we need three-dimensional policy that meets those needs and customer needs. And bringing in that third dimension helps protect the customer interests as well as the policy goals under Minnesota law, including that set out in Section 216C05 of Minnesota statutes, which sets as a policy goal that retail electric rates for each customer class be at least 5% below the national average. Next slide, please. So considering these goals, industrial customers have concerns that hope to see addressed as part of any push towards greater electrification. The first, and I assume that this is part of the kickoff for today's columns, is we do not yet have clear metrics for evaluating when electrification is appropriate. And this is important because increased electrification will likely require increased costs, either in the form of utility pass-throughs or investments that the customers are asked to undertake directly. And increased costs are always a concern if there's no tangible benefit for paying those increased costs. Therefore, it's critical to establish agreed upon metrics to evaluate when and how the increased electrification will in fact increase energy efficiency, reduce carbon emissions, and maximize grid optimization, all while maintaining reliability and achieving competitive and affordable electric rates for everyone. Next slide, please. To dive a little deeper and a little deeper on costs, I want to underscore the recent history of electric increases industrial customers have faced over the past 13 or 14 years. Since 2007, industrial rates have increased by 60% or more for some industrial customers. This has had a huge impact on operations, some of which have curtailed or even indefinitely idled. Note that energy costs for these customers are often 20% to 30% of the overall cost of production. Statewide, the group of the largest industrial customers consumes well in excess of 6 billion kilowatt hours annually. Therefore, a 1 penny per kWh increase means an increase of more than $60 million. Costs matter, which is why clear metrics are for evaluating electrification, and who benefits and pays for that electrification is so important. Next slide, please. In addition to costs, the industrial customers are concerned about potential unintended consequences. Again, our system of utility regulation and the regulatory compact are designed around the notion of large centralized energy generation that's ultimately delivered to the customer at the meter. The public utilities monopoly exists in the public domain, which ends at the customer's meter. If that clear point of demarcation is blurred or eviscerated, there is a potential for significant change to our regulatory system, which may benefit utilities at the expense of all customers and customers' business operations. Therefore, the question must be asked upfront whether and to what extent changes to our regulatory compact should be made to account for monopoly investment behind customers' meters, or if our existing structures should be maintained and investments behind the meter on private property are better left to the private market. And in either case, if ratepayers are to be responsible for funding utility investments in pursuit of electrification, whether in front of or behind the meter, those costs should be addressed and scrutinized in a general rate case setting to afford all stakeholders the opportunity to participate. And as part of this process, and to preserve reliability, stakeholders and regulators need to assess how increased electrification in a decarbonized generating fleet impacts grid reliability, either positively or negatively. So those are the concerns and values and goals. A short summary, and really appreciate the opportunity to weigh in here today and hopefully participate in discussions in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Drew. Next is Kevin Lawless. He's the principal at the Forward Curve and the board chair of Hourcar. Go ahead, Kevin. Oh no, now we can't hear you. We had some audio problems earlier, Kevin. I'm hoping it's a quick fix. Otherwise, we could jump ahead and come back to you once we have a chance to troubleshoot it. It actually looks like you dropped your audio connection. So if you just wanted to navigate to the middle of your screen, it has some like more options for audio, and you can reconnect either through the computer or have it call your phone. And we can hang on for just a minute, I think, if this is going to be a quick fix. Hey, that's looking promising. Try now.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Excellent. We can hear you too. Go ahead, Kevin.
Great. Well, Carl, thank you for organizing this with Anthony. I think you guys have been doing a great job. And clearly with the panel today, you certainly have built a great set of speakers here today. I'm learning a lot from everyone along the way. And also the DOC and DOE for funding and pushing forward on this important issue. Next slide. So I'm representing Hourcar here. Hourcar is a car sharing organization in the core part of the Twin Cities. So we're primarily, if you think about us, we primarily have cars located in neighborhoods, more or less between downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis and into some of the close-in neighborhoods within the cities. We have a fleet of about 55 cars currently, and we are currently engaged in a plan to electrify our fleet by 2022 to go all renewable energy purchases to charge those cars. We've committed to having 50% of the vehicles in ACP 50 neighborhoods. And we also intend to greatly enhance the public charging capability in those neighborhoods. So just to step back a little bit, we've been in business for approximately 12 years, but for the last 3 years, we've been an independent organization. We were previously embedded within the Neighborhood Energy Consortium. We spun out when they merged with CEE. And so we've spent a couple of years building a vision for our future, but also making sure we survive through the process of becoming a totally independent organization. So what I first want to do is give you just fleet transportation is a huge opportunity. And I just wanted to give you a few examples here on this slide of the variety of fleets. So we have 330 million people in the United States, roughly. We've got 274 million registered vehicles, at least as of 2018. So, we're a very automobile-centric economy for most people, but not for all. And about 8.5 million of those vehicles are in fleets nationwide. Now, that number does not include fleets where the cars are employee-owned, such as Lyft and Uber. And then about 1.8 million vehicles are in what you might call car rental fleets. And again, Uber and Lyft are not included in those numbers because primarily they're not company or organization owned. So if you look in the table below, a couple things I just want to highlight. Vehicle ownership can be, as I've noted here with Uber and Lyft, can be very different models. Fleet size, obviously, we're obviously a very small player here, but we think we have a very important role with our focus, as I'll talk through in the rest of my presentation. We currently provide two-way trips. So a member of Hourcar can pick up a car, drive it, and they need to bring it back to where they picked it up from. One of the things we offer that the traditional like Hertz or Avis offer less of, we offer a very short-term rental. It can be, minutes to hours. So if somebody needs to make a quick trip to Target or the grocery store or to go pick up a relative, go to a medical appointment, our car may fit that bill, and especially if there are not fixed route transportation alternatives. We've made a commitment to go 100% EV by 2022. We haven't made a public announcement yet, I don't believe, but the last piece of the funding for this plan was approved recently. So we're in great shape, and we have great partners in this project with Excel, City of St. Paul, City of Minneapolis, American Lung Association, and numerous others. In comparison, Lyft, so let's go to average trip length, for instance. 25 miles is kind of like the last hard look we took at how our vehicles were being used. When you get into the ride-hailing industry, like Lyft and or Uber, it's like 5 or 6 miles is the average trip length. And of course, with Hertz, Avis, and the other car rental companies, people are generally renting cars for a day to a week or more. So, and as far as we can tell, Hertz has not made any specific commitment to electric vehicles. Next slide. So you might think that, so we're a nonprofit, and when we started down this process of electrifying our fleet, we had some things we recognized that we needed to do better at. We know that climate change and emissions from transportation disproportionately impact people of color and low wealth neighborhoods in the urban area. We know, and we recognize that transportation equity and environmental justice is really important for how we build the U.S. economy going forward, and we want to be a part of that rebuild and reconstruction. The voices and needs of people in those communities really need to be heard and must be heard early in the process, not after we've fully developed a plan. And along the way, we want to make sure that we build out collaborative relationships with the neighborhoods and the members for Hourcar and potential members. And to do that, we need to break down silos, recognize that transportation is integrated within the broader economy, the broader society, and as well as like a car sharing alternative is integrated with the rest of the public infrastructure to provide transportation. Next slide. So how are we doing that? We started a process late last year. We have a core partner council of 10 neighborhood groups representing most of the areas in which we're anticipating placing electric vehicles and charging stations. We've been applying a design thinking type of process where we're really, we've had a couple sets of focus groups. We've also had some prototyping done. And again, a lot of this work got done early in the year, pre-COVID. And we've got some really interesting results coming out of it that are helping us modify how we're going to build out hubs and exactly where we're going to place them. So from our perspective, we're working really hard to make sure that the groups and the neighborhoods where we're anticipating we'll be operating in our new electric vehicle driven with our electric vehicle driven fleet to make sure that their voice is heard, that we meet their needs, and that we find ways to increase our footprint and enhance our services to them. Next slide. So this is a preliminary hub network for us. The green circles with the automobiles in them represent where we would have charging stations, approximately again. And our plan is to have 70 charging stations across the two cities. Our hope is that people would have no more than a 5 to 10 minute walk to a charging station. And that's in comparison to the STARS, which are the current public electric vehicle capabilities in these areas. And you can see also the ACP 50 areas, which are census tracts where people are 40% of the people are at 185% of poverty level, federal poverty levels or less, and that 50% of the neighborhood is persons of color. So you can see we're trying hard to reach those neighborhoods. We've worked with members of the city councils, respectively, and their staff in each of the cities for preliminary placement. And we're anticipating that, you know, while this is a preliminary map, this is approximately where we anticipate the 70 charging hubs to go. And again, when you think about it, that's roughly 2 cars per hub that we would have, because we're anticipating 150 cars, 150 electric vehicles when we have the full rollout complete. Next slide. So what does a hub look like? As I said, we're anticipating 70 of them. We anticipate that most of them would have 4 level 2 chargers available. 2 of them would be reserved, or at least have some hours of the day where they're reserved for Hourcar vehicles specifically. And 2 of them that would be open to the public for use. In addition, 20 of the chargers, or 20 of the hubs would have level 3 fast chargers, which would allow us as Hourcar to, you know, when we really need to get a car charged up, we have an ability to do that quickly and get it back into service. But the other point here is that we anticipate that these will be close to bus and rail lines so that people can integrate the use of an Hourcar with, you know, public transportation, fixed route transportation. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I just want to touch on the benefits here. First, it's all about access to clean transportation. You know, as we think about electrifying transportation in the U.S. economy, in the state of Minnesota, and in our cities and towns, we want to make sure that at least we're playing a role in providing that access to communities of color and low-wealth neighborhoods. We're providing flexible options that allow people to have transportation that can't be met by any current fixed route transportation. So those ones that either go beyond where light rail or bus routes go, that's what we're trying to serve. We'll have a stronger, cleaner, quieter transportation network with our plan in these neighborhoods. And we know that the climate change impacts of electrifying the fleet, particularly when we're going to use renewable energy to charge the fleet, is going to provide society with some significant benefits, as well as benefits from lower fossil fuel emissions in the local communities, and those communities that are often left behind in the process of building out our infrastructure here. So with that, I'll let Carl move on to the next presenter and take your questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. Next up is Carmen Carruthers. She's the Outreach Director for the Citizens Utility Board. Go ahead, Carmen.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and wanted to thank all the people who have played a role in making this presentation possible. It's been a great event. Next slide, please. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so I first want to explain who the Citizens Utility Board is. We're an independent nonprofit consumer advocate. So we advocate for clean, affordable, and reliable energy for Minnesota's residential and small business consumers. That's our emphasis. And we're really looking at all energy issues and how they affect consumers. And today we're going to spend time talking about how beneficial electrification will impact consumers and actually how consumers will impact it. So next slide, please. So, beneficial electrification has kind of the implied title that it's going to benefit people. So electrification is beneficial to consumers if we're reducing carbon and pollution, and if we're providing good options for consumers. And consumers are going to play an important role in making this viable in the future. Not only would they be impacted by this trend, but they are going to play an important role in determining how this trend actually picks up speed. And what it does to their utility bills is going to be a really important issue. That's something that I've heard previous speakers make mention of, and that's really part of the heart of what we look at from a consumer aspect is what are our energy bills in the end? And then, in this kind of discussion, talking about what role does beneficial electrification have in impacting our energy bills? Next slide, please. So when we're talking about energy bills and the impact to consumers, price is obviously a very natural determinant of how we're going to change our behaviors. So with beneficial electrification, there's an assumption that we're going to be making it cleaner and relying more on renewables. So we need to shift our demand for energy to when renewables are plentiful. And that means consumers are going to be expected to be shifting their demand of when they're going to be using their various appliances or mechanical systems in their homes. So we need to understand that how electricity is priced is going to impact people's behaviors. There's also this other issue of, can people shift their behaviors? That's another topic that will be touched on. So rates can be an incentive or a disincentive for how we use energy and the patterns in which we use energy. So next slide, please. So, all of us are energy consumers. Most of us are probably paying our electric bills, or it's built into the rent that we might be paying. There's several different rate structures that are common in Minnesota. Those would be the first three. So we have a flat rate structure where we pay the same amount regardless of when we're using our energy. And it doesn't change how much we consume too. It's still a flat rate on a per kilowatt hour basis. That's very common across the state. There's also seasonal rates where we may pay a higher rate in different seasons. So especially in the southern half of the state, we often pay a premium in the summer months. So June, July, August, and September is pretty common. And this is often combined with the flat rate. So it's sort of a hybrid rate where because demand for electricity tends to be the highest in the summer because of air conditioning, we're going to pay more in the summer for the energy we use. It's a pure supply and demand issue. And then there's also tiered pricing structures, which some of you may be familiar with, where depending on the amount of energy you consume, you pay increasingly higher amounts the more you use, or it can be in the inverse where you pay less per unit the more you use. And this is common as well. Minnesota Power has a tiered pricing structure. Different co-ops have pricing structures depending on what type of behavior they're trying to encourage and kind of how the economics work out. So the next two rates are things that you're probably hearing more about and play a potentially vital role in making beneficial electrification work from the aspect of trying to use more renewables on the grid and manage the use of those renewables. So a time of use rate will change the charge you have for your electricity based on the time of year or time of day that you're using the electricity. So for example, during a peak energy time, which tends to fall somewhere around 4 o'clock to maybe as late as 8 p.m., when there's just a lot of energy being consumed, you would pay a higher rate during that time because there's more demand. On the flip side, using energy overnight can be much less expensive to produce. That's when the wind's blowing, and many of us recognize like wind power is some of the least expensive energy available to us. So people would be encouraged to shift their usage into those less expensive time periods to generate it. And then the next level would be kind of more real time. And this would be really matching the demand for energy to the supply. So when I talk to consumers about this, one of the analogies I give are the HOV lanes in the Twin Cities area, where you're getting charged, if you're in the min pass lane, you get charged based on the congestion levels on the main part of the road. So that would be an example of how real-time pricing might be used. And with technology, people can be alerted to different potential changes and try to switch their behavior quickly. So just to kind of focus in on how price and structures of rates will impact the implementation of electrification. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, oops. So one of the things I wanted to touch on when we talk about like the technology that the switches we're going to need to make to electrify homes is understanding the reality of having to retrofit a lot of our homes. So when you're building from scratch, it's not so difficult, right? But when you look at this chart that looks at our housing stock, over half of our housing stock was built before the 1980s. So there's a lot of retrofitting that's going to be required, as was kind of alluded to before. And if you go to the next slide, please. This is critical in terms of, from a consumer impact, the timing is so important. So you have an older home, and how often are you going to replace these appliances that might already be operating on fossil fuels? Not very often. So you think about a furnace lasting approximately 20 years, an air conditioner the same, water heaters somewhere around a decade. So consumers need to really be active participants if they're going to move towards beneficial electrification, because they need to be thinking ahead at the point that these appliances or mechanical systems need to be replaced. What are they going to replace them with? Because they only get to do this every decade or two. So a really important thing in terms of consumer education, and also mention of like contractor education too, and helping inform people what their choices are. It's the middle of January, your furnace goes out, you don't have a lot of time to make a decision. So these things need to be thought of ahead of time. Next slide, please. And finally, keeping in mind when we think of all these aspects about potential pricing changes, the need to replace things, retrofitting, who has the benefit of actually getting to make those choices? There's a lot of equity issues related to this that have been alluded to. And with that, I want to pass it on to the next speaker, Ben Pastor, who's going to dive into this even deeper. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carmen. Okay, so Ben Pastor's up next. He's our final speaker for this round, and he's the Director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks, Carl. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. You sound good.
Okay, great. And no worries about the title. I know it's a mouthful. So thanks, Carl. Thank you, Anthony, and thanks to the Department of Energy. And thank you to my fellow presenters and everyone here this morning. Good to be with you all. I'm Ben Pastor. I direct the Energy Access and Equity Program at Fresh Energy. And I'll be talking about advancing equity through electrification. And I'm going to try to stick to my 8 minutes, as I know we wanted to save some time for Q&A. So next slide. So just some quick background on Fresh Energy. We're an independent energy policy nonprofit. And for 28 years, you can keep clicking through, Carl. We've been working at the state legislature, the Public Utilities Commission, and with state agencies and local governments to advance clean energy in Minnesota. So next slide. And one more is good. So in my 8 or roughly 7.5 now minutes, I'd like to start by level setting with a definition of equity, talk a little bit about why it matters, and finally to discuss how we can advance electrification equitably. And you can keep advancing, Carl. And one more. Great, thank you. So first, to level set, when I talk about equity in my work, I refer to it as having 2 main components. I refer to it as the elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. So the emphasis is really on both the process and the outcome. Next slide. Now on to why it matters. So many of you have likely seen this information from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which shows carbon emissions by sector in Minnesota from 2005 to 2016. And you'll see that transportation and electricity generation have declined over time, but are still among the highest sources of emissions in the state. And on the other hand, the residential and commercial sectors are at the lower end relative to other sectors, but have actually increased over time. Next slide. You might also be familiar with this information from EIA, which I think Jenny alluded to earlier, showing that that compared to the US average, Minnesota has a higher proportion of homes heated with natural gas and propane. Next slide. We also know that from several recent reports, including from Rocky Mountain Institute and UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health, that gas appliances can present dangers to public health through increased indoor and outdoor air pollution. So this image is just a quick, simple visualization of some of the common pollutants presented by appliances in the home. And these pollutants largely align with the EPA's criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act. Next slide. But drilling down a bit deeper, it's important to recognize that air impacts do not affect everyone equally. As these graphics from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency show, under-resourced communities, renters, and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to higher levels of air pollution. The left diagram shows the aggregate relative risk level compared to the statewide average, separated by a number of identifiers. And the right diagram shows the proportion of communities that are likely to live near higher levels of air pollution, above PCA's risk guidelines. Strikingly, that's 46% of under-resourced communities and 91% of communities of color. Next slide. And we also know that these areas of concern for environmental justice are found all across the state, as this map from the Pollution Control Agency demonstrates. This highlights federally recognized tribal lands, areas with a substantial portion of under-resourced households, and communities of color. And moving on to the next slide, we know that renters in particular face a unique set of barriers. Fresh Energy is proud to be one of the co-leads of the Minnesota Multifamily Affordable Housing Energy Network. And from our work, we've seen the significant barriers faced by renters in making energy improvements in their homes. These include lack of ownership, which means that renters have less or no ability to make independent decisions about things like energy efficiency upgrades, installing an electric vehicle charger, or rooftop solar. Another issue is the phenomenon known as the split incentive, which means that a building owner may be less inclined to invest in upgrades when the renter pays the utility bills, or on the other hand, that a renter may be less inclined to conserve energy when the building owner pays the utility bills. These barriers are especially problematic when we consider that renters on average pay a higher proportion of their income toward energy costs compared to homeowners, and that in Minnesota, just 41% of people of color own their home, compared to 77% of white households. Next slide. All of these elements are borne out in what are commonly known as the social determinants of health. According to the Minnesota Department of Health and Pollution Control Agency, the largest contributor to overall health among these is social and economic factors, which include income, racial discrimination, transportation, and housing. And I'll touch on the next slide really quickly. As we've already seen today, the energy sector is increasingly considering more electrified end uses, including heat pumps and electric vehicles. Next slide. So in that context, I wanted to return to our definition of equity, which includes both process and outcome. And moving on to the next slide, taking things out of order a bit, let's talk about the potential outcomes of electrifying homes. Among others, electrification can create healthier and safer homes, save money and energy in the long run through lower energy use, and improve air quality. However, given the considerations I mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that not everyone has the ability to invest in these upgrades, and that given our cold climate, it will take major energy efficiency investments to make electrification viable. We see new construction affordable housing as a major opportunity here. And as Carmen noted, in the case of existing housing, it's important to consider deep, holistic retrofits, especially for under-resourced households who have been historically underserved. I'll also echo some of the questions that Jenny raised, including what might happen to under-resourced customers who are less able to opt out of being served by natural gas and the related costs there. Next slide. sorry for the transitions there, Carl. So on the vehicle side, electric vehicles can help address carbon emissions from the transportation sector. And electricity as a fuel source is consistently more affordable in $1 per gallon equivalent compared to gasoline. However, while more affordable options have become available in recent years, upfront costs can still be a barrier. And so as electric vehicles expand, it will be critical to explore strategies to leverage resources to enable access for individuals of all income levels. And I think the Hourcar model that Kevin mentioned is a great example of some of that exploration that's already taking place. Next slide. So we've talked about the outcomes. Now let's talk about the process. Next slide. Equity requires an inclusive and participatory process. For all of the reasons discussed earlier, all of the disproportionate impacts and inequities, it's critical for community members and impacted individuals to not just have a seat at the table or a place in the room, but to have a voice in the process and leadership in it. Next slide. To that end, Greenlining and the California Energy Efficiency for All Coalition created an equitable electrification framework, which emphasizes community needs, community-led decision-making, and developing strategies that leverage available resources and improve outcomes along tangible metrics. That framework is available on Greenlining's website, as well as through the Energy Efficiency for All project. So I'd certainly encourage everyone to check it out, or I'm definitely happy to send it out to folks who are interested. Next slide. So just in conclusion, one last reminder of our definition of equity. It includes both the process and the outcome, and with proper consideration of both of these components, we can help ensure that electrification strategies truly benefit all. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Okay. So we have about 10 minutes before the end of the webinar, and we have gotten a number of questions. I think I'll go ahead and ask a few as I can, and I want to make sure I save time to open up the poll that I promised at the end of this event as well. So one that we got in, these aren't exactly in chronological order. Jenny Edwards mentioned a concern about stranded gas assets. Do any of the panelists have thoughts about how the impact of stranded gas assets can be mitigated? Does the solution need to include legislation? Does anyone feel like jumping in on that one?
It could easily take up the rest of our 9 minutes, but I'll just say I think it is an important question. I think some of the things to think about are, there's tremendous value in those assets in the long term. What can they be used for? And then part of it is just the sort of fixed cost investments that need to happen that get spread over right now a large number of customers. So as you shrink that pool, it increases the cost per customer. And I think, gas industry folks know about those fixed costs better than I do, but it's worth thinking if there's some improvements that can be made to some of those as well. So, but very big, very important question.
So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So there's a question about how to evaluate when decarbonization benefits exceed cost. And so the kind of two-part questions are, how do we evaluate and do we include the greenhouse gas and carbon emissions costs in doing that? And then the other part was moving on from that question about carbon, also how do we evaluate and value indoor air quality in our analysis of costs? Maybe Jenny and then Ben, or Winona. I got to unmute Winona. There you go. Sorry, Winona, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, I don't really understand how that person is thinking, to be honest, because you have to start evaluating the impact of CO2 emissions right now because it is increasing exponentially. And so I don't know what the cost benefit analysis is, if you're doing any kind of whole system analysis, if you're doing anything like looking at the stranded liabilities of fossil fuel infrastructure, the fact that, you put in something new like a pipeline, the equivalent of 50 new coal-fired power plants, You can't simultaneously approve 50 new coal-fired power plants and an energy efficiency and decarbonization plan for Minnesota. It doesn't make any sense. And so, the long-term analysis, which is hitting us in the face now with climate change and weather-related disasters, is that you need to begin decarbonization now and figure out how to make this transition. And since with COVID and the pandemic, we've already decreased our emissions and our energy use significantly. Now is the time to make the plan for what the future looks like. It's a great opportunity, but looking at, I'm an economist by training, and I can tell you from my Harvard education that if you want to just look at decarbonization in some box, that's not really where we're at in the world. We need to look at the really holistic impacts of all of our energy choices and how we transition.
Yeah, Carl, you want me to weigh in? I think the question may have been directed at me.
Sure, go ahead.
And I think the real point that trying to make here, because we're looking at electrification as in the context of a variety of choices, right? And so we have when we think about what choices we want to make, and devoting, limited resources to making those choices, where do we get the most decarbonization for our buck, so to speak? Right? So, electrification may provide some benefit, but the point being that if there are other items or other initiatives that can be undertaken that provide even more benefit, then in order of priority, let's take the ones where we get the most benefit first. And then as we evaluate each one of a variety of options for decarbonization, in order to understand what the priority is, I think you do need to do a cost benefit analysis, and that's all the point that I was trying to make.
This is Brandy sitting in for Ben. He had to go to a council meeting. I think we break it down even more. You break it down to simply conservation, be smarter about your use before you even talk about adding any electrification to it. That's the first thing, even before we go and look at putting solar PV out. How can we reduce our consumption first? And then look at doing these things. So when you said, Andrew, the low-hanging fruit, that's exactly what it is. And it's something we can do immediately today.
Thanks, Brandy. Appreciate that. That actually goes to another question we got. How do we ensure weatherization, insulation, and air sealing is happening before electrifying heating loads? They want to talk about that from the communities they represent in terms of efforts they've seen to be successful.
Well, I think you got to fund it. Weatherization at some real rate in these northern communities. The housing stock is old, and all of the recommendations being made are excellent. But you've got 50-year-old housing stock, you've got substandard housing stock, you have vision at maybe Leech Lake to build housing stock that will, address efficiency and then electrification, but it really needs to be resourced by agencies to make it work in these rural communities.
I have to agree with Winona that it's vitally important. And the nice thing about weatherization is it's this perfect transition if we are going to do electrification, because it helps you immediately, whatever fuel source you're currently using. So it's really a logical first step, and it addresses energy burden as well, because it'll bring down your bills immediately, but the upfront costs tend to be the big challenge for a lot of consumers, especially low to moderate income households.
And I guess I'd just add, to the extent that electrification is being incentivized through policy, and ensure that, deep retrofits are equally being incentivized, that those are packaged. And then the second major force that's going to address this is going to be the workforce and the people that consumers are interfacing with when they want to electrify their homes. So ensuring that, insulation companies and HVAC companies are often not the same, but doing work to better link those industries, knowing that the consumer benefit in the long run is going to be to have the tightest home possible before you size and install and pay for a system.
Okay, well, I think based on the time, we should probably wrap up. I'm gonna launch the final poll so people can answer that. It has some. I've been impressed with the questions people have submitted. There are a number we aren't able to get to. If it's a kind of technical answer in relationship to a presentation, I'll see if we can't track down an answer from one of our presenters. But a lot of the questions that have been asked are also helpful to just think about how to frame this next phase of this electrification work. So I'm launching this poll now. There's a few short questions to answer in this, and these results won't be published at the end, and I will keep this poll open even after the event, so you can continue responding as you're able to here for the next 15 minutes. I do want to pass it to Anthony for any concluding remarks. And Anthony, we did have one question you maybe could quickly address in your final comments as to what the expected format of the outcome is for this stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. To answer that question, I think that's something that's sort of to be determined as we go through this process. Obviously, there's certain requirements that we need to meet for DOE's purposes as the funder, but really hoping with the next stakeholder meeting and then the technical advisory committee, we're really going to sort of dig into what would be the most helpful content and focus of the eventual report that comes out as part of this project. So we obviously want to have a goal in mind, but we also want to make sure that we're incorporating a lot of the views that have been brought up today and in future meetings into what that report eventually looks like, and not to preempt that. So thank you for that question. Also, just many thanks to the speakers today. That was just a great round of presentations and incredibly informative. Thanks to Carl and Michael's Energy for facilitating and running the platform here. I meant to mention this earlier, and this is, I think, probably a statement of the obvious for most people, but our approach to this stakeholder process over the next few months will continue to be online and virtual until further notice. And so the September 9th meeting, which I hope many of you will be able to attend, will be online, and then those technical advisory committee meetings following that will also be a virtual setup. So with that, I'll hand it back to Carl.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. So just a last mention that the website is listed here, and it should, I hope, spit you out there after you close the webinar as well. And on that webpage, you can find under the calendar page information, a link to register for the September 9th meeting. And I'll just put up Anthony and my contact information here for the last, a chance for you to write that down if you need to reach out to us for anything. And a last thank you to all the speakers for their preparation and comments today. I really appreciate it. With that, I will leave the poll open for another 10 to 12 minutes, I guess. But this concludes the content for the webinar today. Thank you, and we'll see you again on September 9th.